Pashi Delay. I'm Ashwin Verghese, Communications Officer of the International Campaign for Tibet, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Tibet Talks, a series of live conversations about Tibet with inspiring thinkers, leaders, activists, and artists. On today's episode, we have a very exciting guest. She is the author of a new book called Eat the Buddha, Life and Death in the Tibetan Town, which the New York Times described as a brilliantly reported and eye-opening work of narrative nonfiction. Spanning decades of Tibetan history, the book tells the story of Ngaba, which is now tragically known for having the largest number of Tibetan self-immolations. By focusing on the lives of Tibetans from this region, our guest today illuminates the nature of the Tibetan-Chinese relationship, as well as what it means to be Tibetan in the 21st century. Our guest is also the former Beijing bureau chief of the Los Angeles Times and the author of the award-winning book, Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea. So please join me as I welcome our special guest for today, Barbara Demick. Barbara, welcome to Tibet Talks.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that lovely introduction, and thanks to ICT, whose research we've used many years reporting on Tibet.
Thank you very much, and we were very excited to have the book, and it's been a major topic of discussion for all of us. So we're so glad that you can be here today to talk about it. And to get the conversation started here, I would like to welcome our host for today's event. She is the Director of Outreach at the International Campaign for Tibet. So please welcome Tensho Gyatso. Tensho, welcome.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you.
So we'll get the conversation started in just a moment here. But first, one housekeeping note for our audience. If you're watching this live and would like to ask questions for Barbara, please email your questions to comments@safetibet.org or post your question in the comments section of the live stream on our Facebook page. So with that, Tensho, I will turn it over to you to start the conversation.
All right. Thanks, Ashwin. Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara, for joining us. We're looking forward to a conversation with you today. Thank you first of all for writing this book. The subject of your book is so important, and the place you write about is one that has been at the heart of the Tibetan self-immolation protests. And reading your book makes us really learn a lot more about that. So I have a lot of questions for you. But first, I want to ask, how did you become interested to write about Tibet? Because your first book was Sarajevo, then you wrote about North Korea, and you didn't really have a background on Tibet that I know of. So that's my first question. How did you become interested to bring Tibet as your book?
I mean, I have to back up a little, but I moved to Beijing in 2007 as a correspondent, eventually bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. And I didn't really have a China background either. I had a strong reporting background, but I was a bit of an outsider. I'd been to China many times, but and the part of China that I found the most interesting, the most intriguing was Tibet, and also Xinjiang. I mean, I think like many of us, I looked at the map of China, and I saw everything was kind of along this northeast corridor going from Beijing down to Guangzhou, and then there was all of this out there. And, journalists are really kind of attracted to mysteries. We like challenges, but I mean, that's kind of a trite thing to say. I also somehow I saw Tibet as the soul of China. There's always a lot said about China wants control over Tibet for the water and the western border and the mountains and strategic blah, blah, blah. But, at the time I moved to China, there was a lot of discussion about how China, as it had gotten rich, had sort of lost its soul and its meaning. And Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism seemed so much part of China, and I was intrigued, and I really wanted to understand Tibetans themselves beyond, some of the cliches that we see in the Western press.
That's what His Holiness says also, that Tibet has something that can contribute to make China better, and give something that's missing in China is what is in Tibet. So that's kind of in the same lines as you were saying. So, well, I'm glad to know that that you felt that connection, and you decided to write on Tibet. And when you did, you picked also a very remote town of Tibet to focus on the very edge of the Tibetan plateau that not many Tibetans might have also visited. So how did you end up, after you decided you wanted to write on Tibet, how did you decide to write about Ngaba and pick a topic it's very, very difficult to address?
That's a good question. I mean, in my previous books, I worked with microcosms, one place as a representative of the whole. My first book was about one street in Sarajevo. My North Korea book focused on one town, Shenzhen, one city. And it's easier. I knew I would take a microcosm. I would take one Tibetan town, and that it would not be Lhasa, because Lhasa, at the time, it was difficult for me to go to Lhasa. I subsequently went to Lhasa, but it was, I didn't want a showpiece with tourists. I wanted, a more ordinary place. So I had that idea well before the self-immolations began. And once
because you started visiting in 2007 and 8, and the self-immolations began in 2009.
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't really consider the book to be about self-immolation. Some of the headlines have been, capital of self-immolations. But Ngaba seemed to be the obvious place because it was in the news. It was very difficult to visit Ngaba, although it's, we as a journalist, I was allowed legally to travel to Ngaba. I was an accredited journalist. I didn't sneak in that way. It was very difficult. There were always checkpoints, and foreigners weren't allowed to check into hotels. And it also had a very interesting history. I stumbled upon some writings by two Tibet scholars, Matthew Ackister, who's British, and Li Jinglin, who's Chinese American, about the Red Army's occupation of Ngaba during the region during the Long March period, and about some of the uprisings during the Cultural Revolution period, and it just seemed like an interesting place. So, I had to pick one, and I thought about Repkong, I thought about Golog, where I'd actually spent more time, but it just, Ngaba seemed the obvious choice.
And you had visited Ngaba at that
time? At the time I decided to do Ngaba, I had not visited Ngaba. I had been sort of in the area around, but the fact that it was the hardest place to visit kind of made it the obvious choice. It was like, what was it that we weren't supposed to see?
And then in the book, you focus on, you've written about several characters that you follow, and through those characters, you tell the whole history. So, and one of those characters is also a good friend of mine, Gombutso. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about her.
Well, thank you for asking about Gombutso. She's a wonderful person, and she's the daughter of the last king of this region. Until the late 50s, this part of Tibet had, had local rulers that sometimes they were considered just
Chieftains.
fiefdoms or
Mhm.
chieftains. There were different words. The Chinese
Yes,
called them tusa, but the Tibetans used gyalpo, king.
yes.
And um, the story of this kingdom is actually very much the story of Ngaba. Um, my book opens in 1958, which is really when the Chinese Communist Party took over this part of Tibet. And the photo that you're seeing, this is Gampo, is the
The
small child
young,
in front
yes.
with the short hair. And,
Hmm.
I was told that all the girls in Ngaba at that period had their hair cut very short. And I'll crowdsource this because I could never find out the reason. If there's anybody out there who knows why, send me a message. Um, but the young girls had their hair cut very short, and she was about 7 years old then. It was really one of the last photographs of the family at their palace.
Hmm.
Her father is standing directly behind her.
Hmm.
Um, they were basically kicked out of their palace and exiled following the year 1958. And my book actually opens with that scene in 1958, which is really when a lot of this started, when she, as a small girl, um, was
Yeah, and the people of
captured.
Ngaba have a very special relationship with the May royal family, May Gerbo's family. They have a very special, they hold them in very high regard. They have a very long history relationship, yes? And you
Yes,
share that in the book.
yes, and my first trip to Ngaba,
Hmm.
there were still, which was 2000, well, 2013, but 2014, when I was really able to spend time there, there were still older people who remembered the king and remembered Gampo. Fortunately,
Hmm.
some passed away, and um, they had very warm feelings about this kingdom and about the relationship between the quote unquote aristocracy and the common people. I mean, it seems like he was a good, fair ruler, and some of the issues that came up elsewhere in Tibet were not so present in Ngaba.
Hmm.
It was a very, you know, as these things go, equitably run kingdom.
Hmm. And Gombo has, after that photograph we saw from her when she was 7, her life has gone through so many ups and downs. And, you read about it in your book. And then I also think of all the other Tibetans who went through the same period, who went through so many ups and downs. So your writing about her tells also the story of what's going on, what went on through the whole of Tibet. So I think we have some more photos of Gombo that we wanted to share, and maybe you can tell us a little more about her.
Sure. I think the next photograph is from Chengdu. Um, so they were exiled from their palace in 1958 and exiled from Ngaba. The king abdicated and he was held and struggled against for a few years, but the family was resettled in Chengdu. And at that time, there was still, I think, an effort by the Communist Party to bring in some of the former Tibetan leaders to try to, make the, to use the Chinese word, harmonious, integration of Tibetans into Chinese society. So they lived in sort of a hotel residence for ethnic minorities in Chengdu, and they, um, um, had actually a decent life. I mean, the king was sad he had no kingdom, but he was alive. Gampo is in the top left. Um, her sister Dolma is on the right, and the girl in the middle is actually the youngest sister of the king.
Yeah.
King and
But
his family.
the rest of Gombo's family all had very tragic deaths. right?
This was
Mm-hmm.
taken. You can see from the clothing. Well, Chengdu is always
Mm-hmm.
warm, but you can see from the clothing they're in summer clothing, and this was shortly before the beginning of the Cultural Revolution
Mm-hmm.
in 1966. I think it was just weeks later,
Mm-hmm.
she was recalled to Beijing. She had been attending the high school associated with Minzu Dashwei, the
Mm-hmm.
ethnic school, and that would be the last time the family would be together. And she and actually her aunt survived, but her parents and sister did not.
Yeah. So now I want to also focus on Ngaba. So we said Ngaba is, since you spend so much time looking into uh, Ngaba, talking to the people of the region there, talking to people in exile, as well as who are there in Ngaba, in Tibet. What do you think is, Ngaba has had in Tibet since 2009. There've been almost 50 self-immolation protests in Ngaba, when all of Tibet over there were around 156. So what do you think, what is it about Ngaba that has produced so many protests? And why do you think Tibetans were led to such a drastic type of protests?
I think Ngaba was and is in some ways on the front line. It's on the eastern edge of the Tibetan plateau in Amdo. And so it was really one of the first places where the Chinese Communist Party collided with Tibetans, and it was really a center of resistance starting in the 1930s during the Long March period when the Red Army came through the Tibetan Plateau in flight from the nationalists, and not having food or provisions with them, started stealing from Tibetan homes and monasteries, eating statues, which I think were not really Buddha statues, they were Dharma.
So that's how you got the title of the book. It comes from
The
that.
title, the Buddha. But, it left a very bad impression and sort of set the stage for years of animosity to come. During the Cultural Revolution, which we're getting up to, there was an uprising also in Ngaba of Red Guards who thought they were, restoring. Actually, they were socialists, and they thought they were restoring Mao's original will to respect religion. But there was always something happening in Ngaba, and I mean the big tragedy, of course, was 1958, and the period that Gampo was exiled from her palace. Ordinary Tibetans, many of whom I'm also writing about, who are not aristocracy, were also exiled from their homes. Their livestock was confiscated. Their kitchen supplies were confiscated. They were forced into communes. There was, great hardship, great starvation. At
Lots of suffering.
that time, the monks and nuns were kicked out of the monasteries, which were closed. And most people who follow Chinese history think this happened during the Cultural Revolution a decade later, but it happened in really in 1958 for Tibetans in this area, and there was just a tremendous loss of life and suffering, and I think that those traumas, became part of the legacy that was inherited by younger Tibetans. Although, many of their parents didn't want to discuss these stories, they were there, and it's interesting. I've been reading lately about the field of epigenetics, which is the study of inherited trauma. on subsequent generations. The sons, particularly, of World War I and World War II veterans, the children of Holocaust survivors, people whose parents suffered great traumas. And this is not like a flaky theory. There's really a lot of study of this. Carry a certain amount of trauma in them. And it was very interesting to me when I started looking more carefully at who self-immolated. They were often the sons and grandsons of people who were involved in these earlier battles, and they had their own issues. This area of Amdo, Ngaba had been governed with a relatively free reign in the late 80s and 90s into the early 2000s. There was a lot more intellectual freedom and linguistic freedom than in Lhasa and the Tibet Autonomous Region.
Through the 80s, when there was some little period of relaxation.
Yeah, and then especially in the period before the Olympics, there was a real crackdown, and there was always a debate within the Communist Party.
The 2008, 2009, that period.
They were getting a lot of limitations on their ability to travel, not even to travel, outside of Tibet, but just, to get from province to province, or township to township. It was very hard to get travel permits. There was a lot of pressure on the monasteries, and once it started, it spilled out. And, there was, I think, also a copycat element, as one person did it and another did it. I think it also, ties into some of the Dalai Lama's teachings about nonviolence, is that people took the teachings that you shouldn't hurt others very seriously, but they were willing to hurt themselves. And we've been reading a lot about the civil rights movement lately because of what's happening in the United States, and I think you see some of that when you read about the late John Lewis and this idea of redemptive suffering, that they felt through their suffering they would show their devotion to Tibet and their strength. It was a message.
Yes, we know, many of these the people who undertook the self-immolation protests. We don't have much information about the people themselves, but from those that I heard of, many of them were selfless people who cared about others, people whose motivation seemed pure.
I wrote about a very interesting case, which was a middle-aged Tibetan man in Ngaba who was having a dispute with his neighbor. And he had joined a WeChat group dedicated to nonviolence. And he wrote before he self-immolated that he was afraid he would kill his neighbor. I thought that was quite interesting. But, there's also Tibetans I spoke to about the self-immolators had their own theories. There's one person in my book, I call him Dalai, which is his nickname, Wild Baby Yak. And he had several friends and a half-brother who self-immolated. And he thought there was a personality type of somebody who was very quiet and unable to express themselves and didn't feel like there was any other outlet for their emotions. So there was a certain type. There was a certain type of quiet person, not in all cases, but in a lot.
So can you tell us, Barbara, also how was the Chinese reaction to and how did they deal with the self-immolations? And, what has been, because now what has been the impact of all of this on Ngaba today? What do you think?
I think the self-immolations were just a tremendous loss of face for the Chinese Communist Party, because there's an enormous amount of Chinese propaganda devoted to, the theme that Tibetans are happy. Tibetans are so happy under Chinese rule. There was always some poll that said Lhasa is the happiest city in China, and a lot of exhibits about Tibet showed, the images of the struggling serfs from the old days, and then happy Tibetans singing and dancing in costumes. And this was a statement. Hey, we're not happy, and they reacted. Sometimes at first they kind of like, well, nobody Chinese is getting hurt, but then they became quite harsh, and they tried to punish witnesses and family members for homicide. There were a lot of sort of novel legal theories that came out to punish the families and friends of self-immolators. And, that of course made it worse. It started a whole cycle where it perpetuated the self-immolations because people became angrier.
Yep, I remember there would be one self-immolation, and then the whole region would be locked down with no cell phone contact, no, they would just began to take some very drastic measures.
Yeah, they cut off the telephones, and in that period, it was even impossible to call government offices in Ngaba because many of us journalists were trying to visit, and
And you were still in Beijing at that time?
I was in Beijing, and we were trying to visit legally. So we had a bureau in Beijing. We had to follow the laws. But we couldn't get through to the government offices, and then we would ask the offices in Beijing, are we allowed to go? And they were like, sure, you're allowed to go. But then you'd get there, and there would be a checkpoint. It was as though the Chinese government wanted to contain the contagion, so they really closed Ngaba off.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, given all of that, how would you say, what's your sense of life for a Tibetan today? Oh, there, Ashwin is showing a government checkpoint. So this is what typical. Do you want to, Barbara, maybe say a few words on that image?
Yes, this is actually what Ngaba was like the first time I went in. I'm not exactly sure what year this was. I think 2012. I didn't take the photo. I went in the first time in 2013, and there were these checkpoints. I mean, it was a military occupation zone. Every other car on the street was an armored personnel carrier, a canvas covered troop transport truck, police cars. I mean, it was just, it really looked like the war zones I'd covered, and there were, I think still are, cameras above the roads photographing everybody coming in. Life for Tibetans, one of the points I make in the book is that, there are Tibetans who have enjoyed the fruits of rising Chinese prosperity. There's no doubt about that. But it's really not about money. It's not about the economy. It's about personal freedom and rights. And, I think, obviously Tibetans everybody has a different viewpoint, but something that I've heard a lot from more successful Tibetans is that one businessman in particular who I met, who was, quite successful. He had 2 homes, an apartment in Chengdu. He had a late model SUV, nice clothes. What he didn't have was a passport, and which made it very difficult for him to do business. As a young man, he had been doing some trading with the border at Nepal. And he said, I have everything I want in life except my freedom. And he was not a particularly activist person, but he wanted, he wanted, like other, Tibetans, 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 he wan Tibetans to be able to travel. And in this period, not right now because we're under this coronavirus lockdown, you see Chinese citizens traveling all over Europe. They're in Paris and Venice. Their kids are going to university in the U.S. and Australia, and Tibetans want some of the same. They want to have, if they're going to accept Chinese rule, they want to be treated as Chinese citizens, and they're not. They're treated very harshly, and
even for traveling within Tibet, they have restrictions for Tibetans that are not there for Chinese citizens. So,
and the constant, criticism of the Dalai Lama is very painful for people. I mean, it's really offensive and provocative. And, I also heard from other Tibetans, including this woman, Gampo, is like, if only they would stop saying these things about the Dalai Lama, I could accept. And I mean, I haven't even gotten into the language issue, but there's, there's so many things, so many basic freedoms. I'm not talking about Western democracy, but that they're lacking. And, when I talk to Chinese about it, I always say it's not about the economy. That's not the issue.
Yeah, and China goes to extreme lengths to block anything with the Dalai Lama, and you write about some of that also in your book, and also the issue of language, because those are the two things that are very, very important for Tibetans. The Tibetan culture is intrinsically linked to the language, and not being able to study the language, not being able to, have access to the language and access to the Dalai Lama. Those are two things hit Tibetans very, very deeply. And with language, how, as you traveled and you researched, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts to share on that also. So if you could share something on that.
Well, I mean, there's many issues about language. I mean, first of all, the thing that is Tibetan is not some obscure tribal language. It's a very important language. A lot of the most authentic versions of Buddhist texts are in Tibetan. There's huge. I mean, you could know this better than I because you read Tibetan, but there's a vast Tibetan literature and religion, science, medicine, geography. There's epic poems. It's not some obscure unwritten language. And a point that's not often made about language is that children need to learn in a mother tongue, even if they're going to learn another language. People who don't have a strong mother tongue are intellectually stunted. And, I would allow, okay, maybe Chinese is more useful than Tibetan. I'll say it. There it is. But if a Tibetan child is not allowed to study in Tibetan, they're not going to develop intellectually. Maybe their Chinese will be better and they can get a job in a hotel as a tour guide. But intellectually, they will not develop. And, it's not just that they're cut off from their culture. It's brain development. I found the rules about studying Tibetan and learning Tibetan really varied from place to place. One town would have schools teaching Tibetan, another would not. There's in Ngaba, I know there's a proposal to change the last primary school that's teaching in Tibetan as a primary language into Chinese, and I think that's going to cause some unhappiness. I mean, it already has caused unhappiness, and as I said, what I've seen has varied greatly. I was in Lhasa in 2017, and I don't write about it much because I was as a tourist, and as I said, I try to abide by the rules. But my impression was that there was very little that was in Tibetan. Um, I remember being, in the airport, and there's a Burger King there, at least there was in 2017, and the menu was in Chinese and English. And the Tibet Airlines official magazine was in Chinese and English. It had some Tibetan calligraphy on the cover, like for decoration. And, some of the street signs and the maps, the Tibetan was sort of fading. And, I think it's clear that everywhere that Tibetan is being reduced.
And that's something Tibetans face. You wrote also in your book, we read about another character who was a middle school teacher.
Yeah.
Who was teaching Tibetan, through Tibetan language, teaching very creatively about Tibetan history and about Tibetan identity. So even with strict measures, Tibetans inside Tibet are finding ways to learn about their culture and teach it to the younger generations.
And to the older generations, it's very, very interesting. I think this has been shut down a bit by the Chinese government, but there were many during their summer vacations or winter vacations would teach Tibetan to older Tibetans who were, illiterate in their own language, and that was very popular. They would set up, blackboards in the field, and just to increase literacy, and that also, I think, was in some places shut down by the Chinese government. As I said, it's very hard to say, this is allowed or that is not allowed,
yes.
because it varies so much from town to town.
I think for me, what you said is very true. And your book, when we talk about Tibet these days, we tend to, there's so many areas that you talk about that you forget how complicated and deep the issue is for Tibetans, and what is it really like to be a Tibetan today. And you've, in this book, you go back, you read about these characters, and you go through these, like, Kirti Rinpoche, who's the head of the monastery, the main monastery in Ngaba, he always talks about the hurt that is felt over 3 generations. So you get a sense of that. So I want to, many Tibetans, especially those in Tibet, can't be writing their own stories. So through this book, you've done that for them. So that's something I wanted to say to you, to thank you also for doing that.
I think I've mentioned this because I feel that, I feel a little bit strange as a non-Tibetan, as a non-Tibetologist, writing a book in the voice of Tibetans. I feel like there's a little bit of an issue of cultural appropriation. But at the same time, it's so difficult for Tibetans living inside Tibet to write their own stories. And even when they leave, or if they leave, it's very difficult because they worry about what would happen to their families back home, or whether they'd be able to visit again. And so there's, it's one of the reasons it's very difficult to write about Tibet. Even, so many Tibetologists who've devoted a lifetime to learning the language and a whole career, get banned if they write honestly. So it's very, it really is very difficult for anybody to write about Tibet. And I was just going to follow up with something else you said earlier about young Tibetans. I think a lot of young Tibetans are genuinely very conflicted because, they want, they want good jobs, they want homes, they want cars, they want the same thing as anybody else. But do they give up their culture and their background to learn Chinese, maybe join the Communist Party? I mean, it's kind of like, do you fight them? You quit and fight them, or do you fight them? It's like this impossible dilemma between, it's not just faith, but family and culture and tradition and China, and they're really forced to make impossible choices. And I heard this again and again from Tibetans inside Tibet and also in India. Um, do they work on their Chinese, try to get a civil service job? They're really in a very difficult position.
Well, and then if the restrictions placed on Tibetans who work for who have government jobs, on visiting their temples and monasteries, they get noted. They have now strict security checkpoints, and where they go in and out, they check who's gone where, So it's really, really, really tight control over what they do, and especially when it comes to religion and cultural events. Even in, you might have heard this also, but school children these days, if it's a holiday, if a Tibetan important day falls on a Saturday or a Sunday, the school children get called back to school for classes because they don't want them celebrating the Tibetan cultural events. So we do see a lot of that. Do you want to speak about how it was when you visited Lhasa and other areas of Tibet? Were you able to visit any of those as a journalist or as a tourist? How were the restrictions, and how was, how do you feel you were being followed or monitored, or, did you see the same checkpoints?
Mm-hmm. I was not able to get a permit to visit Lhasa as a journalist. So I went as a tourist, and as I said, I did not write about it because, I was following the rules. And, frankly, it was a little bit like visiting North Korea. Not quite as bad, but, I had minders pretty much the whole trip. And, I could walk around Lhasa unaccompanied. As soon as we left, there were checkpoints between every, there must have been 4 or 5 checkpoints between Lhasa and Shigatse. And we had to, some places we had to register at the police station. So it was you really would be impossible to do any kind of independent tourism. And there were actually very few Western tourists. There was mostly Chinese tourists, and there were a lot of Chinese tourists.
How did you feel speaking to Tibetans? We get. How did they react to you as an American who was visiting there? They probably didn't know you were a journalist or researching on you.
Yeah, I mean, Tibetans were always very friendly, and I would say the sort of ordinary people, the farmers, the nomads, the people who did not have positions of power, were very, very welcoming. And the people who were higher up, especially in the party, were terrified if they knew I was a journalist. There were a couple of times I mentioned this in the book that I'd sometimes hear Tibetans speaking at various government-sponsored events, and if I would call them to request an interview, they would just hang up. They were just clearly terrified to speak to me, for fear there would be some retaliation against them because they had, more to lose. It was tricky with regular people because we do really have a kind of strict code of ethics,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't, if you're talking to somebody who you're going to quote, especially, or write about, even if you're not using their name, you can't. You have to tell them that you're a journalist. You can't
Mm-hmm.
deceive them that way. And so that was often very tricky because I would meet people and they would want to, take a picture and put it on WeChat. And I'd have to say, don't do that, but I didn't, it was often a little complicated.
So I think we're going to take some audience questions, but before we do that, I want to ask one last question. What's your sense of the future? We ICT, we have a lot of members people who care about Tibet and who support work for Tibet. Would you like to share some thoughts for them? What do you see? You've as a journalist, you spent time in Beijing. You've been following this. So, do you have any thoughts you might want to share with our members before we take audience questions?
I mean, the current situation in China is not good. The trend is towards more control, less intellectual, linguistic freedom. I mean, you're seeing that from the universities in Beijing to Hong Kong to Xinjiang, where you see maybe 1 million Uyghurs basically incarcerated in these re-education camps. So, at the moment, things don't look great. In the long term, I don't think the problems are as intractable as, some other international quandaries, Israeli, Palestinian, situation with Hong Kong. I'm not very optimistic about these. I mean, the Tibetans, I think there is space for accommodation. Just put it that way. I don't follow the politics that carefully, but I think there are certainly people in the Chinese ruling class who are very interested in Tibet, are very interested in Tibetan Buddhism, and aware that they've benefited from Tibetans' overall adherence to nonviolence. I mean, it's one of the things that struck me about Ngaba is, writing about the last 2-3 decades in Ngaba, I couldn't find a single case through all the self-immolations, through these major protests in 2008 of a Chinese person being killed by a Tibetan. I'm not saying it didn't happen, because it must have happened. There must have been 2 guys who got into a fight about a woman or got into a fight in a bar. I'm sure at some point, it happened. But, since the uprisings of the 60s and 70s, I didn't know of any cases. And, I'm hopeful that there's space for mutual understanding. And, I'd mentioned that, several of the people in my book have Chinese spouses. Gampo ended up married to a Chinese man who she met when she was sort of sent down during the Cultural Revolution.
When she was at the labor camp.
Yeah, one of the entrepreneurs who I profile in my book was married to a Chinese woman. And this is Gampo and her husband. I'm just refer to him by his nickname Xiaotu. And they were both exiled to a farm in Xinjiang, and this was around the time of their engagement. They're still wearing their military uniforms, and so as I said, I'd like to be hopeful about.
Yeah, I agree. I feel that way also. I feel the Tibetan spirit is resilient, and Tibetan culture and the connection to the land and the people is very, very strong and holds. And we have also the Dalai Lama that connects all the people of Tibet together. So anyway, I want to leave some time for questions also. Ashwin, do we have audience questions?
We do, and thank you guys so much for this conversation. I want to start out here actually with a comment from one of our members, who's named Jane Robinette, someone we know well. And Jane writes, thank you, Barbara Demick. We so much need this book. We have far too little access to information about the current state of life in Tibet. I think that's a thought that we all echo. Of course, we want to hear the voices of Tibetans themselves, but we just don't have that opportunity. So this book is so valuable. So thank you for that, and thank you for the comment, Jane. I want to move on now to a question from Dolkar Jamyang. And the question is, Barbara, have you experienced any backlash from the Chinese government yet due to your book? Any kind of restrictions on your travel with this book coming out? Have you heard, have you received any sort of backlash?
I have not. Some comments on Twitter and this and that, but I haven't. And I'm really hoping that Chinese people will read the book. Those who can read English, it will also be published in Taiwan. And I mean, this may be crazy, but I don't consider the book, militantly anti-Chinese. I mean, in the book, Chinese people do some bad things. Chinese government does some bad things, but I really tried hard to be fair, and I say this again, and we really made an effort not to, violate any Chinese laws in the process of writing the book. So, we'll see. I know, in general that anybody who's written about Tibet has problems, but.
Well, like you said, many of the characters in the book end up with Chinese spouses, so it's certainly something where you get to see the lives of both groups of people. Moving on, now we have a question from Professor Tenzin Dorji, and his question is kind of on the flip side: how has writing this book on Tibet enriched your own life?
It's a good question, and I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah.
A lot, because I went in really as a journalist. I mean, I wasn't Buddhist. I wasn't not really a particularly spiritual person, I must admit. I'm kind of like a hard-bitten New Yorker, but there were like a lot of the Tibetan attitudes towards nonviolence, and the Tibetan attitudes towards, acceptance of their lives and acceptance of other people, I found very heartening. And as I said, I've really thought a lot about Tibetans, their position in China, vis-a-vis the experience of African Americans in the United States, Black people. So, I'm still thinking, and it's still developing. And although my book is done and I should be moving on, I've been reading more about Buddhism and about nonviolence. So, if you check back with me in a year, and I'll let you know.
Yeah, we'll have you back on in 2021. We'll ask you then. So. So I have another question here from Anne on Facebook, and this is something you kind of touched on a little bit, but Anne asked, what about religious persecution? Is this addressed in the book? Obviously it does come up, and we have talked about it a little bit during this conversation, but is there anything else that you would like to share? I know you said that this is, that's one of the things that offends Tibetans the most about Chinese ruling over their land, is how they infringe on their religion.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pressure on the monasteries, and on ordinary people. I mean, I think in some of this patriotic education training, I mean, the overall message is, you have to love your country before you love the Dalai Lama. And I mean, I think that's the heart of it, is if people love the Dalai Lama more, they're not going to love their country. And that puts a lot of pressure on Tibetans, to be, it puts them again in this impossible situation. And I've seen this, I've seen this with young Tibetans who are not particularly religious, but they're stuck. And then the monasteries are just under a lot of pressure. How they teach, how many monks they have, who can become a monk, whether monks can, get travel documents. It's just they make it, very difficult in every which way. And, this whole thing about, school children being pressured not to celebrate Tibetan holidays, civil servants not being able to go to monasteries. I mean, this is a real issue. China is a communist country, so I'm not saying this, this kind of derogatory way, but it means a lot of people work for the government. A lot of people are civil servants, and again, they're just in an impossible position.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And we're almost out of time here, but we did have another similar comment on Facebook to what you were saying about how Tibetans are told they have to love the country first. There are also many examples of people involved with Chinese leadership saying, well, Tibetans should sing about how happy they are living under Chinese rule, or Tibetans have to cheer at certain events, or they benefited so much from Chinese rule. I'm wondering if you can comment on that. I mean, do you feel that is that a perception among the Chinese people that Tibetans really have benefited from living under the Chinese occupation of their land, and is there really that kind of attitude from the government that these people should be grateful, and they ignore all of the restrictions that they place on the Tibetan people, instead think, well, we're genuinely helping them?
Yeah, I think that attitude is pretty common among Chinese people, even educated Chinese people, because they've grown up with this propaganda, and the government releases these statistics about how much government spending there is on infrastructure development, et cetera, in Tibet, and that's true. But a lot of that development is for the benefit of Chinese who've come in. Even if you fly through any of the airports in Tibet, and I've been through several of them. I've been through Lhasa and Songpan, which is not far from Ngaba. I mean, there's very few Tibetans on those flights. It's all for Chinese. And when you see the more ambitious housing developments, some of the nicer townhouses and stuff, I mean, they're clearly designed for Chinese homeowners. The ads are in Chinese and the pictures are Chinese people. So, a lot of that money spent is not directly benefiting Tibetans.
We are at 2 o'clock now, but we just got another question in. And this is a really interesting topic. So let me just ask this one more. This is also from Dolkar on Facebook. Were you able to engage with local Chinese and get a sense of how they felt about the self-immolations in particular? Sympathy, ignorance? Do they think that this was some sort of terrorism or illegal activity? Did you have a chance to talk with any Chinese about that?
A little bit. There's like things I can't reveal. I think a lot of the, I think the Chinese were kind of appalled by it. People I spoke to, I think they also saw that the Tibetans were hurting themselves and not Chinese people, and that they separated it from terrorism that targeted Chinese civilians.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now, we really are out of time, so we will stop the conversation there. But again, we just want to thank you so much for being here with us. And I know I speak for Tencho and for many of my colleagues when I say for everybody watching this, please do get the book, read the book, and also share it with your family and friends. I know from my personal experience, many of my friends and relatives, they have a very vague understanding of Tibet. They don't really understand the history or what's actually happening there right now. This book is a great introduction. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge about Tibet beforehand. You don't have to be an academic. This is something that you can pick up and get a great overview of what the past 70 years have done to the Tibetan people. So please, everybody, check it out. And thank you again, Barbara, for writing this, and thank you for being with us here today. It's been a great conversation, and we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
So with that, yeah, we are just about out of time, but we want to thank all of you who are watching and listening from home. Thank you for being with us here today. We're going to be taking a brief break from Tibet Talks for the rest of this month, but we'll be back on September 10th with another installment of our Tibet 2020 campaign featuring Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Lehtinen, who was a longtime supporter of Tibet, and will discuss the importance of advocating for the Tibetan people. So we hope that you will join us for that on September 10th. Until then, to paraphrase Tenzin Dorji, the first ever guest on Tibet Talks, stay safe, stay well, and stay active. Thank you very much.